It was in the late 70s, as a student at Melbourne Uni, that I was first introduced to the principles of ecologically sensitive and community-based design thinking. At that time, these principles were foremost to Australia's then fledgling permaculture movement, which some of you may have heard of, also a few global thinkers and a bunch of alternative lifestylers. So I was really captivated by the common sense and the spirit of their thinking, while most of my peers at the time saw it as plain dropout hippie. But back in those days, our uni education in architectural design, building science and construction was really solid, and we were encouraged to follow our dreams. At the time, the drivers of global climate change, our country's water shortages and biodiversity loss were only starting to be understood. But it was already clear to us back then that the bulk of this environmental damage and its flow-on social impacts were intrinsically linked to the way we build and live in our cities. So today, more than 40 years on, sustainability is the buzzword. Governments are legislating change in effort to arrest those drivers of environmental damage, which many economists and social scientists now agree will cause irreversible damage to our civilization within about a generation if we continue with anything like business as usual. Our industry's got minimum energy efficiency standards for building envelopes of new houses, as well as many building services and appliances. There are many building materials that now come with green tag or FSC if it's timber, and other eco stickers to supposedly confirm that they're green. As the data gathered by academics and government agencies shows, across the board, environmental performance of a typical Australian home has not improved at all since we started to worry about this stuff 40 years ago. So this graph was prepared in 2015 by Andre Stefan and Robert Crawford at Melbourne Uni. It shows how in the last 40 years, the living space that the average Australian requires or thinks that they require has increased by 240%, so nearly 2.5 times. This then has increased the material and the energy resources we think we require to live in our homes by nearly the same 240%. So we truly live in an age of enlightened greed. So with all that we know today, why are we still consuming and degrading our land, our waters and sky with such a gusto? I'd like to suggest that we need to engage much more directly and empathetically with nature, especially as building designers and urban planners, because it's our actions that have extraordinary impact in this regard. I fear that our souls no longer truly connect with the natural world, with the trees, the earth, the sea, as the souls of our forebears did. We watch David Attenborough on our TVs, and we fly across oceans as tourists when there's no COVID to consume nature. But we rarely venture into the forest right near our home to breathe in and give thanks to its majesty, and also to notice and mourn that it's suffering. We no longer put our hands into the soil to feel its warmth, its moisture, and its rich texture, to tend and savour its yield, without which we're going to go hungry. So missing a profound personal connection with nature and with our social gaze filtered on our buddies, and so struggling to see and feel things through the eyes and the hearts of others, how on earth are we to engage in the design of environmentally and socially empathetic homes and cities? Towards the end of my student days, a few wonderful teachers and mentors taught me to appreciate architecture, not only as a physical product or a constructed thing, but also as a human process, so as a culture for living. At the time, we were inspired by the likes of John Turner and his book, Freedom to Build. Okay, so the following slides are from an outstation in south central Arnhem Land in Northern Territory, from Lake Tyes in East Gippsland, from Moa Island in the Torres Strait region, and from Palm Island in North Queensland. I spent most of my first 12 years as an architect living and working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in rural and remote parts of Australia. So then, as now, Indigenous people from remote communities had very little opportunity to provide for their own housing or shelter needs. Government agencies delivered to communities housing which by its design was unsuited to the local climate and traditional lifestyle. And it adopted expensive and specialised construction methods that discouraged local labour input. Also, the government funds didn't go far, neither in product by way of roofs over heads, nor in the process of generating good work and a sense of homemaking in what were otherwise socially and culturally rich communities. Anyway, my purpose in being there was firstly to encourage and assist the families who are without adequate shelter to design their own homes through what were effective hands-on model making workshops. These workshops centred on the rough and ready use of non-precious materials that help families to relax in the idea of continually building and demolishing parts of their model so they could rework, discuss, and refine their evolving designs. The workshops were accompanied by lots of nights together under the stars in front of a projector screen in those days, discussing local climate, lifestyle, suitable building materials, and construction methods. The families then proceeded to build their own homes using materials which were freely available in the local bush. So the floors were of puddled and waxed earth. The walls were of stone laid in crushed anthill mortar, or they were ram pressed or hand puddled earth bricks. The roofs were framed in timbers in raw pole form, or they were milled with a simple chainsaw attachment. Some internal screen walls, they were framed in sawn timbers and they were lined with split bamboo. So I learned lots of great stuff in those years. And to succeed, these self-help housing projects, they needed to start with a small and achievable scale of works. They needed a generous time frame that was realistic for self-help. And that meant trying to shake off the time constraints that are typical in government funding cycles. These projects needed a few truly committed and self-motivated prospective owner-builder families. It needed a genuinely and unanimously supportive community council, also modest financial support with no strings attached from one or two fair income public servants who are operating in low profile at the local level. And finally, it needed a commitment from myself to live and work with the community through both the design and the construction phases. The families had a common attraction towards stone and earth walling, which I found interesting. While they came to understand that it offered no thermal benefit in a tropical climate, they chose it nonetheless because it was freely available in the bush, and also because, as they would say, it looked proper solid. So traditional materials like bark, brush, bamboo, and woven palm, they were still favoured for temporary ceremonial structures and home decorating. But as primary building fabric, they were seen to provide inadequate storm shelter, pose a fire risk, and to sort of harbour vermin. So that white Australian desire for proper solid housing that had really been taken on board, both in a functional and in an aesthetic sense. And my romantic dream for a utopia Tropicana up north, that was really challenged. I had to accept the reality of community aspirations and allow an architectural style to emerge from them as they designed, built, and explored what was meaningful to them. It took these extended families years of determination and hard work to build their homes. Progress on site, it fluctuated enormously from day to day. It depended more on the talent of the family head in maintaining a strong and enthusiastic workforce than on my effectiveness in skill sharing and technical oversight. So our workforce comprised men, women, and children, all with vastly different levels of skill, strength, energy, motivation, free time. Certainly, we needed to adopt simple construction methods that were suited to a community workforce. And my biggest challenge was to support these people to function as a close-knit work team through thick and thin. And that required careful observation, listening, diplomacy, counselling, and immense patience. And there are actually abilities that don't come all that naturally to me. So that was my challenge. I also came to realise, whilst it was right to encourage good workmanship, because that musters pride, it was also smart to accept what was less than perfect and to make the building site a fun place where a rugby ball and a ghetto blaster were essential tools of the trade. I came to appreciate that sometimes fishing lines were more attractive than deadlines. And I needed to understand that during this time out from work on site, the human obstacles to building process that had me so hot and bothered at times, so things like family issues and community politics, these problems were being resolved quietly and effectively and even without my knowledge. So these self-help housing projects were quite successful in that they brought home ownership within reach of families who were prepared to work hard. And that in turn released community councils from the costs of maintaining and the problems with rent collecting that was so significant with council-owned housing. Also, the homes were built at a small fraction of the cost of those that were designed and delivered from afar by the government agencies. These projects also provided community people with opportunities for skill development in building design and construction, and that then helped them to become more independent of government agencies in providing for their own housing needs. I like to think that we did build and design some worthwhile homes together, but I hope this story also illustrates to you the value of architecture when the focus is on the process as well as the product, because then it can build people and community as well as home and place. If you're interested in reading about community-based building and housing process, these are two books that I've contributed to on the subject. Yep, I like to be clever with steel and wood and to have almighty opinions on the built environment and planetary sustainability. But I also think that if we can view architecture as a verb, to quote John Turner, or as a culture for living, then we've got tremendous opportunity as a profession to freely share our expertise, not only with our peers and our clients, but also with the wider community, because they can then become central players in a rich and collaborative creative process. In fact, I'd like to suggest that this might be the only way in a climate and biodiversity emergency that we have before us that we, architects, building designers, and builders can make real use of our creative skill set and remain relevant as a profession. Some years back now, I worked at Candlebark, the small independent school established by John Marsden, who some of you might know because he's also written a string of very popular novels for teenagers. They're the Tomorrow series, probably being the most popular. I relished in John's fate, supporting me to run a series of workshops with the whole school community, so students, teachers, parents and friends, to elicit from them schematic designs for the upgrade of 6 daggy log cabins that made up the original school premises. It was a heap of fun, and there were some pretty chuffed kids who saw their designs constructed, or their schematic designs constructed. John was then mad enough to believe we could build a wildfire shelter for the kids and staff in the forested setting of this school site, and that shelter could double up as a school library, because John's an author, for the same money that was available at the time for a new template school building funded under one of Kev 07's GFC Buster programs. We managed to do this because we were again able to keep this whole creative adventure within the local school community. Whilst the structural engineers were at first insistent that 1/2 metre of soil on a roof could only be held up by steel and concrete, I remained stubborn in my love affair with wood, which you might have picked up by now. If you haven't yet, you will shortly. The carbon dioxide emitted to the atmosphere in production of cement for the concrete floor and the rear walls of this earth-covered structure, it's fully offset by the carbon dioxide that's sequestered from the atmosphere by the plantation pine that makes up the timber roof structure. Whilst there's some complexity in design detail of the radiating timber portals, this detail repeats itself throughout the building. And that then made it an inexpensive 2-week fabrication task for just one very smart country carpenter, Russell, and his apprentice, Jared. And they were just using basic powered hand tools in a nearby farm shed. So there were no whiz-bang CNC machines here. The portals then took only 3 days to erect on site. I'm not a great fan of green roofs and walls when they're incorporated at height as a shroud to a city building, but it made sense to have this school library come wildfire shelter constructed into the side of a hill with an earth-covered roof. In combination with substantial insulation that's necessary for that southern climate, this earth cover provided exceptional thermal performance and also really great wildfire resistance. At Candlebark School, I could see again that design technique and construction method kept simple and accessible to local people. It allows them to maintain command of and pride in the whole creative process. Okay, between 2002 and 2019, last year, I was heavily engaged with Mullen Creek. It's a peri-urban eco-housing project in Don Vale in Victoria. My job there was to draw positive environmental outcomes from the project that go well beyond and address weaknesses in what was generally considered to be best practice sustainable development at that time. Both in the early project framing, in preparing environmental design and construction guidelines tied to the purchase of lots, as well as through formal step-by-step design reviews and construction overview, we were able to steer some 42 lot owners, 38 architects and designers, building designers, as well as 29 building and landscape contractors to a range of environmentally sensitive practices in their own discipline. Mullen Creek has taken all the obvious initiatives, like a required minimum 7.5 star NATERS energy rating, 4 kilowatt rooftop solar power installation as a minimum, and a 20 kilolitre rainwater storage for every house on the estate. But we also had the opportunity to address these core weaknesses in implementation of sustainable building standards in Australia. And I'll tell you a bit about a few of our learnings, which we're desperate to share widely via the Mullen Creek website, magazine articles, which you'll find some of in Sanctuary and Renew magazines, and in presentations like this one. Thermal performance is based on benchmarks, which for housing in Australia have been set by the BCA at 6 star, by Passive Pulse at around 7 star and a bit, by design guidelines for eco-housing estates like Currumbin Eco Village in Queensland, Beyond Today in South Australia, the Cape in Victoria, and that's Cape Patterson down in Gippsland, and Mullen Creek in Melbourne, and they're all at 7.5 star. And then by professional bodies such as the BDAV's Sustainable Design Challenge at 10 star. Now, 10 star implies that virtually no energy is required to heat or cool a house throughout the year. And even a superficial review of this approach raises a bunch of issues. In 2016, Swinburne Uni and sustainability consultants Pitt and Sherry confirmed what some of us had long feared, and that's that the value of Australia's home energy efficiency rating system, the NATERS, is for the most seriously eroded by lax and optimistic software data entry and by material substitutions and poor construction detailing on site. This terrific report, it demonstrated that these practices reduce the thermal performance of homes as built commonly by 1 to 1.5 star below their certified rating. And you can see on that little table at the bottom of the slide, you can see how much that actually, excuse me, impacts on the annual heating and cooling, or not load, or the megajoules per square metre per annum. Okay. This weakness in the system can be addressed with a few relatively simple measures. What we did at Mullen Creek, we required that energy ratings to 7.5 star be undertaken using Accurate, and that happened at schematic, developed and documentation design stages, all by our one nominated independent and rigorous assessor for all homes across the estate. And once construction was underway, we provided lot owners with a free inspection service to ensure that the thermal performance designed into a home was carried through to the final constructed outcome. Both the energy assessments and the construction overview were generously funded by the developer of the project, being a family of environmental philanthropists, and that's Sue, Steve and Danny Matthews. Mullen Creek also recognises that, certainly in southern parts of Australia, like where the state is, high home energy ratings and rooftop solar power systems are crucially reliant on good access to low winter sunlight between residential lots. So to that end, we modelled and prescribed 3D building and vegetation envelopes that were necessarily specific to each lot on this hilly estate, and inside of which all construction and all new planted trees must be contained. With the trees, it was assuming their mature height and sort of bulk. Unlike standards that apply via planning codes and overlays, to other housing developments in cooler climate zones of Australia, these Mullen Creek envelopes preserve full interlock solar access for each home, even in the depths of winter. So we simply placed dwelling forms as they were submitted to us. They came as 3D models. They were submitted to us for design review, and we placed them into the prescribed envelopes on the terrain of our 3D CAD master file. You can see those envelopes still in ghost form, shrouding the models, the building models. So it was then easy for us to identify where dwelling forms would encroach their envelopes and risk overshadowing neighbouring homes. An evolving estate master model that's regularly updated on the project website provides everyone, so the lot owners and their architects, neighbours and council, web surfers, and of course us as the design review committee, an up-to-date virtual estate navigator tool for exploring things like view lines, shadow lines, and how all home designs on the estate are emerging well ahead of their construction commencing. In cool temperate climates, it's not easy to achieve a genuine 7.5 star energy rating. So that's a thermal performance that almost halves the space heating and cooling requirement attached to the nationally mandated 6-star minimum. We found that homes with anything other than a compact architectural form and a modest amount of well-orientated glazing, it would struggle to reach 7.5 stars without all of the following design features in place. They need to have high levels of insulation in external walls and roof ceilings, double glazed windows with high thermal resistance and solar heat gain coefficient, and interestingly also, they then need to have also substantial and continuous insulation to the lower floors or ground floors. Constructing an on-ground concrete floor with continuous under-slab insulation, so to provide both good uninterrupted thermal resistance and internally accessible thermal mass, that's challenging, it's potentially expensive, and it's a practice generally unfamiliar to the Australian home building industry. For Mullen Creek, we advanced some of these solutions through our ground slab insulation guide, and you can find that on the website. And also with construction details that are now being successfully implemented on the estate for these fully insulated ground slabs. I think that if regulatory bodies want to raise the thermal performance of new homes in cool temperate climates much beyond the currently mandated 6 stars, then they first need to include in the NCC new practical default design solutions for insulated ground slabs to support this raising of the bar. Okay, per square metre of floor area, and I stress that per square metre of floor area, it's fair to say that the operational energy and water efficiency of new housing in Australia, it's slowly improving. What this means though, is that the materials used to construct buildings remains as the primary driver to the overall life cycle environmental impact of a home. Even more so to non-residential buildings. Building services and appliances attached to the operation of homes can be upgraded to embrace new technologies and to provide improved energy and water efficiencies through what needs now to be a long service life for a building. But our specification of concrete, steel, bricks and wood has more serious environmental impacts that are almost immediate, and for the most part, are locked in, less so for us and more so for future generations to face by way of resource depletion, biodiversity loss and climate change. If you believe the science as it's presented to us, what matters most now is how deeply and quickly we arrest CO2 emissions and biodiversity collapse. If we don't move mountains in the next 5 to 10 years, these scientists tell us, our future on this planet will be very bleak indeed. So, if you have a new building in design on your desk, its overall environmental impact across the next 10 years, this period of emergency, like none we've faced before, will be tied almost entirely to the materials that go into constructing it. So you can see here on this these bar graphs, you can see just even a 6-star home that the construction takes up a good half of the overall life cycle environmental impact if the home has an 80-year life, and say it's a 300 square metre home with 4 people living in it. You increase that to 7.5 stars, you can actually see there's not really that much difference. And the space heating and cooling, the thing that Accurate or Natters governs, is only a small portion. It's reduced when you get to 7.5, it's nearly halved, but the overall life cycle environmental impact is hardly reduced. Certainly by adding some solar panels on your roof, say 4 kilowatt is modelled here, you can bring the net life cycle environmental impact down somewhat more. But you can see, if we're looking at this 10-year window, this emergency window where we really need to make big changes, and if you imagine only that being 1/8 of this operational lifetime, or the lifetime operation of the home, you can see 90% of the the impact of the home that you've got on your desk at the moment, the design, is going to be in its construction, in the materials that you select. The World Green Building Council has for some time now put buildings as responsible for 39% of global CO2 emissions. That's mind-blowing. We have an acute and an urgent responsibility to future generations to design buildings that are modest and flexible. Again, you can see from the research of Andre Stefan and Robert Crawford how much house size per occupant matters. It's been very disappointing to me that many of the homes in design and construction at Mullen Creek are way too big, despite the limits to scale that we set by maximum site coverage and prescribed building envelopes. It always brings me back to that question: how much house is enough? How much of the Earth's material and energy resources are needed to comfortably house an Aussie? So this is a small project of mine from some years ago. It's a home in the Strathbogie Ranges in Victoria for clients of German stock who love the bush, wood, and they love all things Japanese. I've always really enjoyed working with them because they prefer to invest in quality, and particularly in fine timber craftsmanship that's without much environmental impact, the craftsmanship itself. They're not so keen on quantity, which invariably causes excessive consumption of finite material resources. I remember a tremendous country builder we had there. He regularly described the project as one large joinery item rather than as a small house. So craftsmanship will earn you money without costing the earth. To offset, at least in part, the considerable problem with building scale at Mullen Creek, we prepared a series of materials info sheets that attach to the estate's design guidelines and that direct lot owners, designers, and builders to materials with relatively low environmental impact, either by formal requirement, we did it, in the case of timber, cement and concrete, or by informal recommendation, as we did with steel and clay products. These guides and info sheets are also freely available on the Mullen Creek website. To pick up just two core building materials, the manufacture of Portland cement is responsible for a whopping 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So that's about, if you do the sums, that's about a fifth of everything that goes into the built environment is attached to Portland cement in terms of global emissions. Across the Mullen Creek estate, it's required that a minimum 30% of Portland cement used in concrete, mortar and rammed earth walling be substituted by other equally performing supplementary cementitious materials, or some people call them SCMs, such as slag, which is a waste from steel smelting, and fly ash, which is a waste from coal burning to generate electricity. These alternatives for wet mix concrete, as well as for bagged cement, are now readily available at most batching plants and hardware stores, certainly across our major cities. To massively reduce carbon footprint embedded in your builds with a no-cost, no-brainer, I'd strongly encourage you to specify concrete and cement with a minimum 40% SCMs included in lieu of Portland cement. And refer to the Mullen Creek Concrete and Cement Products Guide, and that'll make it a complete cinch. You'll see it everywhere. Wood is good. Wood, the ultimate renewable. Responsible wood, and make it wood. Well, contrary to popular belief and some heavy marketing, timber can be the very best or the very worst material you'll work with as a builder. It all depends on where and how it's sourced. If it's sourced sensitively, it can store carbon through and beyond its service life in construction. It can be reused or recycled, or it can be harvested from deliberately planted and sensitively managed forest that'll help maintain healthy ecological processes, sequester atmospheric carbon, and contribute to the social and economic well-being of rural communities. But timber harvested insensitively can result in serious and irreversible impacts on flora and fauna, soil health and waterways. It can reduce or even reverse a forest system's sequestration of atmospheric carbon, and it can erode the well-being of rural and Indigenous communities. Mullen Creek requires that timbers used on the estate be sourced in accordance with quite stringent environmental and social criteria. So essentially, that they be either on our approved timber products list, FSC certified from Australia or New Zealand, or recycled from a prior construction use. We've compiled background papers and a comprehensive list of readily available timber products suited to all applications and budgets. So check them out on the website. We've been really pleased and a little surprised actually with how designers and particularly builders at Mullen Creek are, with minimal resistance, embracing the sustainable timber products we're requiring them to choose from. We know they're carrying this product awareness to their other jobs, and it sends a strong message to the timber industry that a new generation of builders will only entertain wood that's sourced with true environmental and social responsibility. Putting concern about building scale aside, the Mullen Creek project will certainly serve as an exemplar for site-sensitive building and landscape design. It'll showcase energy-efficient architecture, and it'll promote the use of environmentally responsible building materials, so things that you'll see in place on the estate. but I think its bigger legacy will be in published and freely shared learnings, which is a welcome change from guarded IP. And it'll be in the advancement of people, so lot owners, designers and builders who've been able to engage with the project. If you can bear to put up with any more from me, tune into this Design Matters webinar on Friday the 30th of October. In it, I'll cover concrete, steel and timber in more detail, highlighting their climate and biodiversity impacts when they're specified and procured via business as usual. And I'll share with you a design thinking and a knowledge base that supports a more ecologically and socially sensitive approach to material selection, as well as site waste management. And I'll pay particular attention to timber because deciding on the right thing there can be really quite confusing. Over the past 5 years, pretty well everyone in my office has been able to team up with Ceres, which is the Centre for Education and Research in Environmental Strategies. It's in East Brunswick in Melbourne. And they've been able to do volunteer with Ceres to extend the timber initiative from Mullen Creek into the launch of a new social enterprise called Ceres Fair Wood. The profits from Ceres Fair Wood go back into Ceres Community Environment Park. Fairwood removes itself from that adversarial native forest debate that you're all aware of, and also from that opaque environmental certification schemes. Peter and Hayden at Fairwood aggregate and retail timber inside short local supply chains with Victorian and Tasmanian tree farmers and portable sawmill operators who they know personally. They're mainly small producers who are geographically dispersed through Victoria and Tassie, and they struggle to find, sell and deliver to a market that fully appreciates the farm-grown trees and the timber that they have on offer. So Fairwood buys or aggregates only from growers and millers who source wood to the highest standards of environmental and social responsibility, informed by the Mullen Creek project. It shares their stories directly with its customers, they're building and landscape contractors, furniture makers, DIYers, anyone. And Fairwood business builds direct friendships and understandings between city and country folk through this trade, and it encourages farming families to revegetate their bare paddocks with trees for conservation and for profit. On its website, you'll see that Fairwood has a limited selection of local farm-grown and salvaged woods available as decking, wall cladding, flooring, joinery and landscape timber. It's only recently acquired a substantial warehouse that it'll now allow it to gather larger and broader stocks of very responsibly sourced wood. In the next while, I'm also hoping to support Fairwood to become a timber broker. As an extension to the Ceres Environmental Charter, Fairwood would provide designers and builders with project-specific timber schedules based on architectural and engineering documentation that's submitted to it. This service could also extend to takeoffs, ordering, and even arranging delivery of product to site for an entire project if that's what's wanted. Some of this timber might be from Fairwood and the rest would be sensitively sourced from elsewhere. The bottom line would be that the customer is assured timely supply of quality timber via a not-for-profit agency that has strong buying power, non-vested knowledge, and it's ethically placed to aggregate environmentally responsible timber. Okay, architecture that repairs the health of our environmental and social systems It doesn't exist in a bubble. We'll struggle to genuinely practice regenerative design on a principled footing without also living regenerative lives that deeply and intrinsically reconnect us with nature and allow us to see and feel things through the eyes and the hearts of others. I think we can each find different ways, drawing on our individual strengths and experience to live such a life. One of my life's joys that also absolutely informs my architectural work is planting trees. So lots of trees on a small place we have in South Gippsland, and since 1989 a further 400,000 up and down our valley with local farmers and friends as Victoria's first farm tree group. And this is the result in just one patch after only 25 years. And then there's our little mixed orchard where we produce feijoas and citrus and many other fruits that we eat, share with friends and sell commercially, including to Ceres Market and its online grocer, organic grocer, Ceres Fair Food. So these things really sustain me. So to you younger building professionals who are zooming in, I'd like to assure you that there are lots of fun ways to practice. The suite of crises we have in front of us can serve up as many opportunities as constraints. We can skill up to this emergency most effectively by collaborating generously, not only within our profession, but with absolutely anyone and everyone who's willing to play with us. We can include our building user groups as central players in participatory design and construction processes. We can influence and inform new aesthetic sensibilities that have us vomiting at the sight of wasteful opulence and excessive scale. We can celebrate proud self-builders. And we can be in awe of creativity that's born of hardship. We could even suggest that a green building needs to be one that's already there. So together, let's delicately rework existing buildings where we can, apply our finest design skills to minimize natural resource depletion and to give our planet a chance to heal. Except maybe that a gentle, or accept, not accept, that a gentle architectural touch may not catch the eye of today's glossy magazines, but know that future life on Earth will be thankful for it. Now might actually be the time for a revolution in architecture. Thanks everyone for listening to the webinar, and I hope we've still got some time for a Q&A.